Hey everyone, I hope this podcast and my blog and books have been helpful resources for you and will continue to be. But if you've been struggling with a chronic health problem and are feeling stuck, consider coming to work with my team and me at the California Center for Functional Medicine. We work with patients all over the US and have experience treating a wide range of conditions, including GI problems, autoimmunity, hypothyroidism, cognitive mood and behavioral issues, weight gain and metabolic dysfunction, and more. Our unique model teams clinicians with nurse practitioners and health coaches, all of whom are trained in my ADAPT framework approach to provide a high level of care to our patients. This means more support between appointments, personalized guidance on diet, lifestyle, and behavior change, a cutting-edge patient portal with 24/7 access to your labs and records, handouts and resources to guide your protocols, and a team of practitioners working together on your case. We're currently accepting new patients, so if you'd like to learn more, visit chriskresser.com/become-a-patient. Hey everyone, Chris Kresser here with a brief message before we begin the podcast. Imagine a career that draws on your passion for wellness and disease prevention, that harnesses your ability to support and connect with others, that helps you to develop as a person while you help others to do the same. What if you could earn a living while making an impact on thousands of people's lives and even on the future of healthcare? That'd be pretty great, right? Well, that job does exist. It's the job of a health coach, and I believe that health coaches will play a crucial role in the future of medicine, not only in the US, but around the world. 1 in 2 Americans now has a chronic disease, and 1 in 4 have multiple chronic diseases. Chronic disease is destroying our quality of life, shortening our lifespan, bankrupting governments, and threatening the health of future generations. And our medical model is not prepared to address it. Why? Because the only way to prevent or reverse chronic disease is by changing our diet, lifestyle, and behavior. And conventional medicine is simply not set up to do this. Bottom line, we need people who can provide this support to help people make the changes they need to make to save their lives. We need empathetic and compassionate people with a skill for connecting and a passion for change. And my job is to make sure they have all the training they need to do their job so well they will change the future of healthcare. A career as a health coach can be incredibly fulfilling both professionally and personally. It really could change your life, and it can also change the world. That's why I'm excited to announce that we're launching the ADAPT Health Coach Training Program. It's a 12-month, 100% online certification that will prepare you for a successful career as a health coach. It includes training in core coaching skills, functional health, ancestral diet and lifestyle, and professional development. And it's unlike any other health coach training program currently available. To be notified when enrollment opens and to learn more about the program, visit kresser.co/success. That's KRESSER.co/success. Now on to the show. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. I'm Chris Kresser, and this week I'm really excited to welcome Max Lugavere as my guest. Max is a filmmaker, a health and science journalist, and the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Genius Foods: Become Smarter, Happier, and More Productive While Protecting Your Brain for Life, which has been published in 8 languages. He's the director of the film Breadhead, the first ever documentary about dementia prevention through diet and lifestyle, and is also the host of the #1 iTunes health podcast, The Genius Life. Lugavere appears regularly on The Dr. Oz Show, The Rachel Ray Show, and The Doctors. He's contributed to Medscape, Vice, Fast Company, CNN, and The Daily Beast, and has been featured on NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, and The Wall Street Journal. He's an internationally sought-after speaker and has given talks at South by Southwest, the New York Academy of Sciences, the Biohacker Summit in Stockholm, Sweden, and many others. I'm looking forward to talking to Max about his upcoming book, The Genius Life, where he explores the importance of lifestyle and behavior factors beyond just diet in contributing to health, wellness, and longevity. So let's dive in. Max, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. I'm a fan of yours and have been for a while, so this is a real treat.
Let's start. I always like to get a little bit of the backstory. How did you get interested in this world we inhabit of health and wellness?
Yeah, so I mean, I like to tell people that I'm a health and science journalist. I became I was a bit of a generalist early on in my career. I used to work for a TV network co-founded by Al Gore, and although, he's a political figure, the network actually had very little to do with his politics, and it was more sort of like a news and information network for younger people. And so I was one of the main anchors for the network, one of the main journalists, and I liken my time there as having been a bit of a stem cell. Like I got to explore whatever was under the purview of my interests, and oftentimes that included health and technology and things like that. But it really wasn't until about 2011 that my mother got sick that I decided to funnel all of my resources and all of my skills that I had gleaned working at that network into the investigation of why this would have happened to a woman at such a young age. So my mom was 58 at the time, and she was spirited and youthful, and she started to display the earliest symptoms of what would ultimately be diagnosed as a form of dementia. She had something that it actually took us a few years to get a diagnosis. She had something called Lewy body dementia, which actually has
Mm,
more in common with Parkinson's disease. But
right.
for anybody who's familiar with it or has it, it's sort of like having Alzheimer's and Parkinson's at the same time. And I had no prior family history of any kind of neurodegenerative condition. I certainly, might have expected a family member to develop a condition like this in advanced age, but my mom was not old, as I mentioned. And so it threw me and my family completely off guard, and it was traumatic and upsetting. And the trauma of it all was compounded by the fact that in every single doctor's office, I experienced what I've come to call diagnose and adios. Essentially, a physician would, tinker with a drug that my mom was on or prescribe a new one, and ultimately send us on our way. But not once was diet or lifestyle broached. And even Googling, like, I think many people, when they're in the shoes that I was in, they turn to Dr. Google for better or worse. And what you'll end up finding is that these conditions are unpreventable, incurable, and virtually there's nothing that can be done. But what I did at the time was I used the skills that I had learned as an investigator to try to look into the primary literature to uncover what it was about my mom's diet or lifestyle that might have predisposed her to developing this condition. And in tandem with that, what could be done to help prevent it from happening to myself. And the optimism that I saw in terms of what was available in the literature was eye-opening, to say the least. And so that really began what would ultimately become a 10-year journey, doing my own research, reading study after study, but then also reaching out to experts around the globe, many of whom have authored some of the papers that are really showing us how much agency we have when it comes to our diets and our lifestyles and our brain health. And that's what has led to this journey. And it's the question of what type of environmental toxicity or toxicities led to my mom's decline. That's a question that's going to be with me for the rest of my life. It's just something
Mm.
that I'm not going to ever be able to rest on. And so, yeah, it's the basis for all of my work.
It's so interesting. It's a common thread, either a personal experience with one's own health struggle or a health struggle of a close friend or family member that brings us to this work. There's something. It seems like most people don't get too interested in health and wellness unless something like that happens, or perhaps if they're an athlete trying to optimize their performance. But they're, especially when we're younger, it seems like it often takes something very personal like this to draw us in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for as long as I can remember, I've been interested in nutrition and fitness at a pretty high level. I mean, I actually started college pre-med, but I realized halfway through my schooling that I also had a love for storytelling and creativity, and I ended up switching my major to a double major in documentary filmmaking and psychology. But
Mm.
For as long as I can remember, dating back to probably ninth grade in high school, I've been really interested in health science and nutrition, and it was from the standpoint of fitness, I suppose. But
Yeah.
really, it led to me being the perfect substrate to kind of tackle this topic when my mom got sick, because I already had an understanding of, I mean, a very high level understanding, I'll concede, but some of the basics in terms of like nutrition and when I say basics, I mean, these are things that most people still don't even understand, but it allowed me to roll up my sleeves and get to work. And yeah, I was lucky in that I was not personally ever affected by any major health problems. I know you've struggled with, chronic illness, but I was pretty lucky. But, I love my mom, and, it was the most heartbreaking thing to see her decline. And so that really was the fire under the proverbial butt that really got me to engage with this topic in a more formal way.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, you've had an interesting background. I think that the combination of documentary filmmaking and psychology is kind of ideal for exploring some of these topics,
Yeah.
because you can't address or investigate any of these issues without understanding human psychology. And as a filmmaker, I think you directed Breadhead,
Yeah.
about dementia prevention through diet and lifestyle. And then, of course, you the host of the Genius Life, which is #1 iTunes health podcast, and also the title of your upcoming book, which is going to be released on March 17th. Is that right?
Yeah. The Genius Life.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what led you to write this book. I know you have a previous book, Genius Foods. It was a New York Times bestseller and very successful. So how did this next project come about? Like, what was the impetus for this one?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I guess, Genius Foods was what I consider to be a nutritional care manual for the human brain. But as you know, nutrition is just one part of the story. And you could be checking all the nutritional boxes, in accordance with the best available evidence. And, if you're not engaging in regular physical activity, if you're not getting adequate sunlight, if you're not making sure that your vitamin D levels are optimal, if you're not sleeping well, if you're not finding a way to meaningfully deal with your stress, or at least to boost stress resilience, you're still going to be fighting a losing battle. And so I set out to write The Genius Life with the intention of creating a 360-degree sort of lifestyle guide. So all of the simple, small habits that you can integrate into your 24 hours that are going to have a noticeable impact on the way that you feel, but then also really move the needle in terms of your long-term health, in accordance with, what we currently understand to be true about circadian biology, about our codependence with nature, about time restricted feeding, and even nutrition. I go deep into nutrition, sort of a high level nutritional recommendations in the book that are different from Genius Life, and that are more sort of calibrated to help attain the reader's best possible body composition and metabolic health. So, it's more about how to build and maintain lean mass, and to maintain strength as one ages, and how to be able to eat foods in a way that keeps your hunger levels in check. So a lot of people today, I was just reading horrifying statistics that we're on track to become a nation where 1 in 2 adults is obese. I'm not just talking about being overweight,
I
but
saw that story. It's just shocking. And 1 in
shock.
4 are going to be severely obese, not just obese, severely obese. We had to create a new category for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I literally read that 20 minutes before jumping on the call with you.
Yeah.
So I think there's no question that we're living in a world that is out of sync with the needs of our body, and I would go so far as to say that the world has become toxic in many ways. And it's not just that one thing is out of place or awry. It's that the accumulation of all the various factors, whether we're talking about the toxic food supply that's now just overrun with ultra processed foods, refined grain products and industrial grain and seed oils. But it's also the fact that chronic stress is rampant. Most of us are not, or many of us, I should say, are not getting adequate sleep. leisure time physical activity is at an all-time low. So it's the accumulation of all of these many factors that I think overwhelm the body's defenses and predispose us all to, at best malaise, but at worst sickness and shortened lifespans. So actually, when I began writing The Genius Life, which I started writing about 6 months after Genius Foods came out, I mentioned that my mother had a form of dementia, which was very heartbreaking. But what I never would have expected occurred in Labor Day of 2018. My mom was actually diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And by the time it was diagnosed, which is often the case with pancreatic cancer, there was already evidence that it had spread. So it was already in stage 4. And they gave her a 3 to 6 month window. And it was 3 months, almost to the day that she was diagnosed, that my mom passed away. And it was, just horrible and painful and traumatic and barbaric. And, it really, the fact that this happened during the time in which I wrote the book really caused me to kind of like look at the world in a new way. I mean, what were the factors at play for my mom's awful health, that she developed not one, but 2 of humanity's most feared conditions. Mm-hmm. And so those are all the kind of, questions that I posit and explore ultimately in The Genius Life. Everything from our relationship with nature, to light, to stress, to sleep, to food, in a way that's more about sort of health and longevity, on a more broader scale, I think, than Genius Foods, which was really kind of focused on dementia prevention.
I'm on the same page with you about the contribution of non-dietary lifestyle factors. As I do this work, it's been over a decade now, and I think, especially with the population of patients I work with and maybe the people you interact with, a lot of them are already thinking about nutrition. They're doing a pretty good job with their diet. It might not be perfect, but they're at least 80% of the way there. But they might be kind of a basket case when it comes to sleep or stress management or toxic burden or exposure, any number of things that you and I both talk a lot about. So I think those are often the elephant in the room when it comes to health optimization or even preventing or reversing chronic disease. So with that in mind, let's dive into the specifics that you discuss in your book, starting with light exposure. I mean, this is something that my listeners have heard me talk a lot about, but why don't you share a little bit about your research on the effects of light on the brain and body, and then what the kind of easiest and most practical solution to that is for folks.
Yeah. So I think this is a really exciting area for science. And the story is, we're just in the first chapter of what is being called circadian biology, which is basically how our biology responds to cues in our environment that let our genes know what time of day it is. And by far the most potent time setter that our bodies use to gauge the time of day and to then accordingly set off its very many processes that it will undergo through the course of the day is light. And so as a master time setter, I think the impetus is on us to make sure that we are getting good, bright, it doesn't even have to be that bright, and I'll explain shortly, light into our eyeballs, sometime in the morning, ideally, soon after waking up. But generally that light is going to anchor your body's internal clock, which affect everything from your ability to feel energized, to focus, to pay attention, to be at your cognitive best. It affects physical performance. We know that, for example, strength is something that is influenced by our circadian rhythms. It affects digestion. You're digesting at your best. Peristalsis is at its most revved up during the day. I mean, we're diurnal creatures. We're meant to eat during the day. And that's when digestion is, digestive mechanisms are firing on all cylinders. It affects metabolism. We know that we are primed to utilize and partition fuels during the day. We're at our most insulin sensitive during the day. And, the inverse of that, insulin resistance, is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes, which many people struggle with. But then also, our circadian influence affects the latter half of the day as well. So it dictates when the sleep hormone melatonin is going to begin to be secreted by the pineal gland. And melatonin is, a lot of us think of it purely in that context to help us get to sleep, but actually melatonin is a gatekeeper hormone involved in autophagy, which is when our cells clean house. And it's, that's important for longevity. It's important for cancer prevention. And, the secretion of melatonin is dictated in many ways by our circadian rhythms. So the way that it works is we have this small group of light sensing proteins in the eye called melanopsin proteins. And I had the privilege to get to go and interview Sachin Panda down at the Salk Institute, who was on the team who discovered these proteins. And these proteins are fairly insensitive and they're not involved in vision. And their insensitivity is actually, it's a purposeful insensitivity, because if it were so sensitive that, a candlelight would set these proteins off, then our circadian clocks would be desynced from, like really low level light. Thankfully, they're only really sensitive to, it seems, light that is at an intensity of about 1,000 lux or higher, which you can easily attain by just exposing your eyes to just normal daylight. You don't have to be in direct sun. It doesn't even have to be all that sunny out. It can be a fully overcast day. I get a lot of questions from people living in the north, during the winter. How do they, do this when the sun is blotted out most of the day? Well, it can be overcast. You're still getting light at an intensity that is going to anchor your body's circadian rhythm. And what happens then is that those proteins then speak to a small region inside of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is, your listeners don't have to remember that, but I think it's worth knowing where it is in the brain, because the hypothalamus controls some of our very base level mechanisms that are involved in survival. So metabolic rate, our drive to eat, to procreate, these are all controlled in that region of the brain. So needless to say, it's a very primordial relationship that we have with light. And it then, it then functions like a timer, where at every point during the day, your body has plans, essentially. And you can do whatever it is that you want to do, no matter what time of day it is. But it's the question of like, when is it going to be optimal? So, we know that eating food, generally, you want to do it like, when it's sort of light out. We know that that's when we're at our most insulin sensitive, especially if you plan on consuming carbohydrate dense foods and things like that. And so that, I think, is crucially important, like being mindful of the light that you're getting in through your eyes. And also, it's important to know that people have varying sensitivity to light. And I would say the most pronounced variation occurs across the age spectrum. So there's a yellowing that occurs to the lens of the eye. That means that older adults are going to have dramatically less sensitivity to light, in terms of the ability for these light sensing proteins to be activated essentially by light, as people who are much younger. And so a lot of older adults, I think, accept that getting lower quality sleep is just par for the course of aging, when in fact, I think it just means that they need to spend more of their time outdoors. The relationship with light becomes even more important as we get older. And, in light of statistics, no pun intended, that we now spend about 93% of our time indoors. I think that the time for this message, it couldn't be a more opportune time to get this information out there. And then, as easy as it may seem to get that light in through your eyes in the first half of the day, one of the central challenges of modern life has thus become how to, keep super bright light and circadian disrupting light out of our eyes in the latter half of the day, when we're inundated with, light from our smartphones or, TVs that seem to be getting increasingly large, to even overhead lighting in stores like drugstores or supermarkets, which can easily reach 1,000 lux, which is that measure of light intensity required to set off these melanopsin proteins. So, I mean, if you're looking at a large TV screen and it goes white for whatever reason, or you happen to do a late night snack run to the supermarket, you're basically receiving in through your eyes a light at an intensity that is capable of telling your brain that it's daytime, thus completely, throwing your circadian rhythm off into the abyss.
Yeah.
And what that's essentially doing is, Chris, it's causing us all to live in a perpetual state of jet lag, which is why, most of us feel so crummy, I think, it's one reason why I think most of us feel so crummy these days.
Yeah, I think light pollution is one of the least appreciated forms of pollution, at least in the general public. Although amongst researchers, as you pointed out, it's very well established how harmful it can be, and how important the circadian clock is to regulating virtually all aspects of physiologic function. And and because it controls about 10% of gene expression, and genes really are running the show, so it's so critical. What is your personal routine with light and controlling light exposure, both natural light and artificial light exposure at night?
Yeah. So, I mean, during the day, first thing I do when I wake up, I open up all the blinds in my apartment. So I'm lucky in that I have, I live in a place where I get good natural light, which was something that, intuitively, even before I was that familiar with this research, I knew was good for me when I was actually looking for a place to live. So, I mean, I settled on the apartment that I live in now because it has large windows that allow for natural light to enter the living room. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm able to actually spend a good portion of my morning in relatively close proximity to bright natural light. If I have to leave the house first thing in the morning, which I think many people do to commute to work, I like to drive to wherever I'm going, or walk to wherever I'm going without sunglasses on, which is something that, again, before really doing a deep dive into this research, I probably would have put sunglasses on, first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
And so it's important to not wear sunglasses when, during that sort of pivotal time in which, your body is really getting to know or your brain rather is getting to know what time of day it is. And then generally just the more time that you could spend outside, I think the better. The sun, the light, the wavelengths of light that the sun gives off at any given point of day, they vary. And so I do think that there's value to just being outside more often from the standpoint of light and circadian biology, not just in the morning. But it seems to be that the proposed duration at which we need to be exposed to really set off those proteins is about a half an hour. In the latter half of the day, I try to do my best to limit my exposure to bright light, which admittedly can be very difficult, especially when you're, being compelled at every moment to, binge watch the latest show, on your favorite streaming device, which I'm certainly, guilty of too. But generally what I do is in my apartment, I make sure that all the bulbs in my apartment are very warm. And this to me is another one of these tips that seems pretty intuitive, almost, too intuitive to mention, but I look around at other apartments in my complex and, you'd be surprised how many people have these really bright, like almost blue hue light bulbs, like almost like
Yeah.
fluorescent hospital
Fluorescent
bulbs.
light. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. In their homes. And it just blows my mind, Chris.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm with you. I
yeah.
can't stand to be in that light. You go into like a doctor's office or a building like an office building. It's just like I feel like a vampire or something.
I
When I'm
know. I
exposed to
know.
that light.
And
Yeah.
some people actually choose to have lights like that in their homes.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
just crazy to me.
Yeah.
So as soon as I moved into my place, I swapped out all the bulbs and bought these just very inexpensive, slightly more dim, but bright enough where I could read and do all the things that I would want to do in my apartment. But very warm hue, like very, very orangey. They all have like a very orangey glow. And I also have a lot of lamps in my apartment. So, I'm not a big fan of overhead lighting. I think eye level lighting makes the most sense from an ancestral standpoint. The brightest light that a hunter gatherer would have access to would be a campfire, which emits, again, like a very warm glow. It's at eye level. So I'm using like predominantly my lamps at night. And then, of course, I try to limit my use of technology. But then when I am working into the wee hours, I make use of amber colored blue light blocking glasses, which, for all of the many gimmicks that there are out there in the sort of biohacking, health and wellness world, I do think that like amber colored blue blocking glasses are worth the money. And so I do use those. There was research that found that they're, by wearing them for an hour or two before bed, you're able to mitigate some of the blue light induced melatonin suppression
Mm-hmm.
that occurs. So anywhere, by up to about 60% is the, you see a 60% increase actually in melatonin secretion, where it would otherwise decline when exposed to bright blue light. So yeah, those are all sort of the high
Mm-hmm.
level And then also I keep my bedroom very dark because there have been a few studies that show us that even with very low light intensity, that this light is still able to enter through our eyelids and affect next day cognitive function.
Yep.
So I've taped over pretty much all of the sources of light in my bedroom, the perennially blinking alarm clock and everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I typically will wear a sleep mask when I travel, when I don't have control over the environment. And, initially it was not super comfortable sleeping with one, but I'm trained myself to do it now. And I notice a difference when I don't wear it, for sure. So we've been talking about light pollution. There's another type of pollution that has become increasingly common in the modern world, which is noise pollution. And this is probably even less understood than the effects of light pollution. But you mentioned an interesting study in the book about how noise can actually increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. I think every 10 decibel increase in traffic noise increased the risk by 14%, which is, not insignificant. So tell us a little more about that. And then, are there any steps that you recommend people take for reducing their noise pollution exposure?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, that was a little section in the book that I couldn't leave out just because of my own personal experience having lived in New York City.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Noise pollution capital of the world, likely, or one of them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the thing about noise pollution is that, we're unable, our sense of hearing is the only sense that we can't consciously disengage, right? So without your consent, you could be on the side of the road and a truck could roll by and stimulate your body's fight or flight response. I mean, without your consent. And, that has a number of physiological effects in the body. I mean, it's a cascade that was really meant to put us out of harm's way as a hunter-gatherer. But today, in the context of chronic noise pollution, I mean, it can lead to ill health. I mean, there's all these studies now coming out showing us that chronic noise pollution can increase risk of heart disease, of type 2 diabetes. And yeah, I mean, I think it's important to kind of contextualize what noise does to the body. I mean, as a hunter-gatherer, the loudest sound, a loud sound that you might hear, like the roar of a lion, might indicate imminent danger. And so the fact that we're just chronically inundated with, traffic noise and the like, I don't think that that's doing good things to our health. And certainly I didn't feel, at my best when I was living in New York and I was chronically exposed to noise pollution. Also, noise annoyance. There is an actual term used in the medical literature, but being near, living close to a place where there's regular noise annoyance, like an airport, for example, can also have disastrous effects on health as well as cognitive function for younger people. And I detail this in the book. So, I think some really actionable tips. If you have access to a white noise machine, white noise is the kind of thing that, because it's so consistent, we actually can get used to that. And so white noise doesn't really count for, as a source of noise pollution. And in fact, it can blot out noise annoyance. It can blot out those spikes, in whatever the sound may be. If it's like your radiator that, is clinking and clanging all night. I think a white noise generator or like a fan or even an air conditioner can be very useful. I'm a big fan of noise canceling headphones, which I think can be useful, with the caveat that, wearing them is not without risk in a large city because, you might not hear something that might be deserving of your attention, but it is effective in terms of helping reduce that kind of noise exposure. Better insulating your house is another route, for like soundproofing your home, which can be a double-edged sword, because actually elsewhere in the Genius Life, I talk about the fact that, in general, our homes and our buildings are becoming better insulated, and that is causing us to be exposed to greater levels of indoor air pollution. So these are all the kinds of things that you have to kind of be cognizant of. But I think the most important thing is just the knowledge that noise is not a benign phenomena, and that noise, whether or not you want it to, can have an effect on your biology. And when regularly exposed to this kind of noise pollution, that it can have negative health effects.
Yeah, I'm super sensitive to noise and noise annoyance. I love that term. I wasn't familiar with it. It definitely applies. And I always just kind of marveled at people who were able to fall asleep, for example, with the TV on in the background or the radio on the background, or just have some kind of ongoing chatter happening in the background, because that's kind of like nails on the chalkboard for me. But I mean, that strikes me as another aspect of the modern lifestyle that's totally out of sync, because that constant noise, as you pointed out, is probably triggering a fight or flight response, at least on some level, because from an evolutionary perspective, loud noises or uh, noises that are not consistent in their tone would have triggered an alarm response just from a survival perspective, right? If you
Yeah.
have some kind of noise in your peripheral awareness, you're going to be like, wait, what's that? Is that a friend or foe? And I love that you included that in the book, because I think a lot of people aren't really considering the impact on noise.
Yeah. One of the concepts that I advance in the book that I'm super excited to sort of bring into the spotlight is this notion of allostatic load,
Mhm.
which I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. But essentially, we all have a limited capacity of, stressors that we can deal with at any given time, before our body essentially just throws up its hands and we experience the phenomena known as burnout. In the medical literature, it's sometimes referred to as allostatic overload. Things that lifestyle modalities that we know are good for us, like exercise, like saunas, so the use of saunas or cold water immersion, or even intermittent fasting. I mean, these are all good for us in part because they're mild stressors on the body. And this is like the type of stress that I think we would both agree is a good type of stress. But if you're living in a constant state of fight or flight, you have stress in your professional or personal life that you're not dealing with. You're exposed chronically to noise pollution or light pollution on a regular basis. You're already functioning in a place where your allostatic cup, so to speak, is already half full. And then you throw in any additional stressors and caffeine and sleeplessness, and you're just going to hit that tipping point where your allostatic load becomes overload. And so I think it's really worthwhile to look at all the places in your life where you have stimuli that may be stressful, but it's not like the good kind of stress. It's stress without your consent. And noise pollution, I would definitely put in that category. And I would do everything in my power to get rid of it, to cater to it, because then you're beginning every day with an empty glass, and you can throw in things like caffeine if you choose caffeine from coffee, or high intensity exercise, or intermittent fasting. The problem is, I think sometimes with people that don't respond to these kinds of lifestyle modalities that all of us in the wellness world are talking about these days, if they don't respond favorably, it's probably because they've just got too much like going on in their lives. If you're chronically stressed and you're chronically exposed to road noise and things like that, and then you're underslept, you're not dealing with stress, and then you throw in caffeine, which I mean, if you go to my Instagram, you'll see I'm a fan of coffee, but for the wrong person, some of these can actually be disastrous because they just they cause the cup to overflow. So I think it's important to in the acknowledgement that there is no one size fits all diet or lifestyle for optimal health, you really got to uproot the stress, the sources of chronic stress in your life. And yeah, I would put noise pollution definitely in that category. Another source of stress that I talk about in the book is, I mean, even simple aspects of our environment that you wouldn't necessarily think about. There was this really great study that came out that found that people sitting at wobbly furniture, it started to paint their worldview in a way that was less, that was less peachy. They began to favor traits that were more that were less stable in terms of relationships when they were looking at celebrity couples. It was like this very interesting controlled study where they took people and they put them at either stable furniture or wobbly furniture. And they found that just the environment in which a person is sitting can actually affect the way that you see the world. And so those are all the kinds of things that I implore readers to think about and become cognizant of.
Let's continue on this theme. We've talked about light pollution, noise pollution. Let's talk a little bit about air pollution, because this is something my listeners and readers are very familiar with if they follow me for some time, because I've talked a lot about biotoxin and mold related illness, and I've been treating that in patients for many years. There's a growing body of evidence suggesting that both outdoor air pollution in an urban environment and indoor air pollution can contribute to everything from diabetes to autoimmune disease to neurological and cognitive issues. And you mentioned both in your book, so let's dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so many people live with exposure to polluted air, and the kind of pollution that I talk about in the Genius Life is primarily fine particulate matter pollution, PM 2.5 for short, which is basically the most dangerous type of airborne particles, those measuring 2.5 micrometers or smaller. And what they found is that these particles, when we inhale them, they're able actually not only to enter circulation, but they're also able to pierce the blood-brain barrier. And they've found that in heavily polluted parts of the world, that you can see evidence of these particles in the brains of young people, and that when they're there, they stimulate changes that you would more frequently see in much older people, changes that are more indicative of like accelerated brain aging, like the appearance of amyloid plaques, which amyloid, is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is implicated in Alzheimer's disease because it forms the backbone of the plaques that aggregate and clump and are present in the brain. And the latest thinking on amyloid is that it's not necessarily the causative player, but it's there at the scene of the crime, and it's there to sort of reduce the consequences of pro-inflammatory insults. They're doing a lot of this research over at Harvard, and they find that what it could be viral for some people. But what they found is that PM 2.5 has actually been shown to not only cause blood-brain barrier dysfunction, but to promote the appearance of amyloid plaque and these tangled tau proteins way earlier than you would typically expect to see them in the brains of humans. So, I mean, that right there is super unsettling. And then at the other end of the age spectrum, there was a really great review of the environmental factors that play into Alzheimer's risk. And it posited that 20% of Alzheimer's cases alone may be owed to regular exposure to air pollution. Another study that occurred across 48 states found that high exposure to air pollutants increased the risk of cognitive decline in women by 81% and Alzheimer's disease specifically by 92%. So, I mean, air pollution is playing a major, I think, role here. Exposure to high levels of air pollution can affect heart rate variability, which is an important marker of cardiovascular health, which we know the brain relies on. It can create inflammation and things like that. So,
yeah, and I mean, I'm sure you saw this. And last year there was a study, pretty big study, 103,000 births in pregnant women. They found an association between exposure to air pollution and autism spectrum disorders, which of course is, all the caveats apply. It was an association. We can't prove causal relationship, but there are a lot of plausible mechanisms that could explain that. So definitely growing problem. And unfortunately, as is often the case with these things, it's a problem that tends to disproportionately affect people of, disadvantaged socioeconomic circumstances. But what are some of the steps that you recommend in your book and otherwise for reducing exposure to both outdoor and indoor air pollution, or at least mitigating exposure when you can't reduce it? Because some people aren't able to actually reduce their exposure.
Right. I mean, if you live in New York City, it's very hard.
Or Shanghai.
Shanghai.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm very sympathetic to people who don't have a choice. And so, yes, I provide tips in the book, but at a very high level, the best ways to detox, I call it the 3 Ps of detoxification. And that is pee, poop, and perspiration. When you pee, you excrete a significant proportion of certain types of pollutants through your pee. That's why it's always great to make sure that you're well hydrated and that you're peeing clear or light yellow at the darkest. As they say, the solution to pollution is dilution. So making sure that you're drinking ample fluids, making sure that you're eating a diet that's rich in healthy produce, fibrous, dark leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, and things like that. We want to support gut bacteria, certain species of which have been shown to actually block intestinal uptake of certain heavy metals, which are now ubiquitous in the environment. And other, toxic compounds are released into our gut after absorption, and we poop them out. So making sure that you're consuming lots and lots of fiber, I think is a reasonable recommendation, including veggies at every meal. And it's just one of the many, many benefits of consuming plants. I also am...
Don't tell Paul Saladino.
Yeah. No, I know. I'm not a fan of the carnivore movement for most people. I think it can do some people, primarily people with autoimmune conditions or inflammatory conditions well, as a therapeutic diet. But for most people, I think that you're going to be far better off with vegetables. I mean, there's cruciferous vegetables, which Paul actually is not a fan at all of sulforaphane, but actually sulforaphane has been shown directly to help activate the liver's phase 2 detox enzymes, which helps you literally excrete environmental toxins.
Yeah. And that wasn't a dig against Paul. I think he's a very thoughtful, intelligent guy and is approaching this with much more rigor than many others in the movement. And I have a lot of respect for what he's doing.
Yeah. Same.
You and I are on the same page with this, where we recognize the potential therapeutic benefits of it in the short term and possibly even the long term, but that, the risk here is that diet is so trendy as when low carb came along, which is, I believe, also a therapeutic tool, that's not a general all-purpose diet for everybody. Inevitably, people start to think, if it worked for someone else for their X problem, it must work for me, or it must just be something that's good to do. And I even see that happening with carnivore now. People are going on it for really no reason other than they hear a lot of other people talking about it and getting great results. And that's concerning to me.
Yeah, and I echo that. I'm a big Paul Saladino fan. I think he's a brilliant guy, but we disagree when it comes to the necessity of produce,
which is healthy and productive. I've said this often. I'm a huge advocate for disagreement and healthy, respectful dialogue around that disagreement. I wish we had more of it in more areas of health. Paul had me on his show, and I'm going to have him on my show. We had a very respectful discussion where we agreed about some things and disagreed about other things, and I think people benefit from that. I wish there was more of that in this domain that we inhabit.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, so I mean, I think the making sure that if you live in one of these polluted areas, just making sure that you are. I think the harms of air pollution are probably pretty contingent on a person's overall nutritional status and everything else that they're doing to detox. For somebody who's eating a diet that incorporates lots of fruits, vegetables, properly raised meats, eggs, things like that, a micronutrient rich diet, and they're also exercising, they're sweating regularly, they're sleeping, then I think that the pollution is going to have probably a much different effect. But it can obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, but it could. My assumption would be that it would magnify the effects of a less optimal diet. For sure,
I would agree with that 100%. I'm also a fan of air filters. I mean, if you live in China, for example, you in an urban area, you almost certainly have several air filters, because there's no way of living there and not being exposed to huge amounts of particulate matter, air pollution. It's not a panacea, or they're not a panacea, but I think they can be helpful in mitigating the exposure that can't be avoided.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think having an air purifier, I use a reverse osmosis water filter.
Mm-hmm.
I don't drink my water from the tap. I also have plants in my apartment, which there was a really great book written. I forget the author's name, but he was a NASA research scientist. I think it was Wolverton.
Mm-hmm.
About he basically ranked all of the plants that have the potential to effectively and efficiently clean the air in your personal breathing zone, as he defined it,
Uh-huh.
of a few feet around you. And so I actually give readers the top 10 most effective plants in my book.
Cool.
And
That's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Any highlights that you remember? Which ones are more effective than others?
Well, the snake plant is a great plant. The rubber plant is also great. Some of these plants are actually, you have to, if you have pets, you really want to look and make sure whether or not they are potentially toxic to pets, because some can be. But if you don't have any pets, then there's zero harm in having them in your house. But yeah, the snake plant, the rubber plant. There were a few others: the areca palm, the lady palm. There's a few, and they do. Some of them are great at cleaning out formaldehyde, which is used to create wood products that many of our homes have, various chemical vapors and things like that. So yeah, it's important to have plants. And then there's also the stress mitigating role of plants.
Sure.
Just looking at green things,
Yeah, that's
I
been
think can be.
well established now.
Yeah.
Well, Max, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Where can people learn more about your work and your book?
Yeah, so I mean, the book can be found at geniuslifebook.com, and we've got some great bonuses for people that pre-order. But generally, the book is available wherever you buy books. And then I'm very active on Instagram, so you can come and find me at Max Lugavere, Lugavere.
Great. Well, thanks again, Max. It's been a pleasure. Excited about your book. I think addressing these lifestyle issues is really the next step in my mind. I think a lot of people are fortunately considering nutrition, at least, certainly we have a ways to go if we're talking about the general population, but in the audience of people who are listening to these kinds of podcasts, I think many folks have nutrition not, like I said before, maybe not 100% dialed in, but pretty well dialed in, and they could get even more improvement. Instead of trying to take that 80 or 90% to 100% with diet, they could get more improvement by focusing on other areas that have been previously neglected. At least that's what I see in my patients. So I'm super happy to see you addressing that in your book, and definitely recommend everybody go pick up a copy and check that out. And Max, let's stay in touch and do this again.
Sounds good, Chris. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, take care. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresser.L.Ac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.